everybody, welcome. I'm Ann Carey of the Conservation Commission, and we are doing a program tonight on how to better understand and benefit from our brooks and streams and the areas along those brooks and streams. We have two great speakers. I'm going to introduce them both right now so they can just proceed ahead once I stop. Cory Ross is Managing Director of the Windham County Natural Resources Conservation District, and they do incredible projects working with owners of riparian land, education and technical assistance, helping them figure out what to do with those areas. They do riparian planting activities and wetland restoration activities and a number of other things, and there are some brochures over on the table on your way out. If you want to know more, just pick one up. And will be followed by Margo Ghia, Energy and Natural Resources Planner at the Windham Regional Commission. And they work with interested individuals and towns on basin plans for watersheds, river corridor planning, and recently have been doing a lot of work on protecting wildlife habitat and wildlife corridors. And Cory is going to go first and talk about riparian areas.
Thank you for that introduction. I'll just mention this in case I forget by the end. There are also annual reports for the Conservation District over there for 2023. Please feel free to take one if you want to know more about the work that the district does. Margo actually had my job before me, and we work together a lot. We're lucky to be able to collaborate, and so it's fun to do this presentation together.
Cory, can you pause because everybody's walking?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
It's okay.
Right in front of
Just give them a second to get
Come on
settled.
and sit down.
It's great to see such a nice turnout,
behind you.
especially on a nice night.
Nobody's sitting in the super comfort.
Really? Okay, here we go.
Okay, so a quick overview of what I'm planning to talk about. Buffers, what are they? What are the functions and benefits of buffers? Design elements, kind of like what goes into planning a buffer planting. And then funding options and partners that you might be able to work with if you want to install a buffer on your land. And then we'll do questions at the very end together, just to kind of keep the event flowing. So, pretty simple, a buffer is a transition between land and water, right? So, not all buffers are ecologically sound because that transition could be a lot of things. So what we're really talking about tonight are buffers that serve a function for protecting water quality, helping wildlife, preventing erosion, things like that. So we're talking about a naturally vegetated width of land. Like I said, in that transition area between the water and whatever kind of upland use might be there, whether it's a house or a road or a business. And ideally it's composed of a mix of trees, shrubs, ground cover, and undisturbed ground. Buffer vegetation intercepts runoff or rainwater, and it hopefully allows it to infiltrate into the ground instead of just running across the surface and carrying whatever it has in it into the water body. So that's one of the really important benefits of a buffer for water quality. Here you can see a stream that has nice buffers intact on both sides. And then a thing that's frequently forgotten about when we talk about buffers is the duff layer. So I work with landowners to implement these plantings, and folks can generally wrap their heads around, like, yes, we want trees, but there's a desire to manicure the understory, right? And it's like, no, it should look like the woods. It should look wild and a little messy. Wildlife likes messy, definitely. And then there's all kinds of benefits from that duff layer. It's a great absorbent, and it encourages better infiltration of runoff. And then all three layers of vegetation are going to serve a function. So vegetation, like leaves, can absorb the energy of the falling rain. So a heavy rainstorm is going to be more destructive, right? It's going to create greater erosion. So leaves and branches intercept some of that and absorb the energy. Roots hold soil particles in place. And then vegetation helps to maintain that absorptive capacity. And then vegetation slows runoff velocity and catches sediment. And if you just Google this, there are all kinds of great demonstrations on the internet of, a plot of grass and a plot of dirt and just pour water over them and watch what happens. It really does work. But there are lots of benefits to a healthy buffer. Shoreline stability or riverbank stability, healthy aquatic ecology, filtration of runoff, flood damage control, benefits to wildlife habitat. Margo's going to talk more about corridors in a little bit. It helps with groundwater recharge, something I think we'll hear more about with climate change. And then, of course, nice scenic value, can provide privacy for your property, and it can increase property values. So, shoreline stability, like we talked about, roots and vegetation are going to help hold together the bank. There's an example of what it looks like when we don't have such a healthy buffer in place. You'll see a lot of this right now around Windham County and around Vermont in general, pretty much since Irene. There was just catastrophic flooding and there are cut banks, and we can't really do anything about them now. We have to wait for these long time cycles to play out so that rivers reach what we call equilibrium, where they're kind of in balance with themselves. And it takes a long time, and that's a frequent call we get from landowners. Are like, I've got this crazy bank like this, and can't we anchor it? Can't we do something to it? And unfortunately, not a lot. So that's why we want to get buffers in place when we can. Healthy aquatic ecology. There's all kinds of critters that live in our rivers, right, and in our lakes, although we're kind of focusing on rivers today. So having a buffer intact is going to do things like lower water temperature, provide cover, shelter for things to hide from predators. Particularly some of our fish that run upstream really do need shelter. They need places to hide from predators, and then you need to keep the water temperature cool. And that's a huge challenge on some of our streams if they don't have a buffer in place. And even on large rivers, buffer trees provide shade and help cool the water. A silty or a muddy bottom offers less diversity, supports a lower variety of organisms found in that kind of water. And it also promotes algae growth, and algae growth results in lower oxygen concentration, and then when there's no oxygen, you get like die-offs of aquatic organisms, kind of like Long Island Sound is suffering from right now. I talked a little bit about how critters need places to hide. Large wood that falls into rivers and streams. Another thing that sometimes people are like, can't we clean that up? It looks messy. It's actually really good, right? That's how the woods in the rivers look if we leave them alone. Large wood or down woody debris and the leaf litter that falls in are important. They offer habitat for fish and other organisms. They help keep the water temperature cool. And that's kind of, of course, I think lots of folks in here know about beavers, right? Mm-hmm. That all fits together nicely if we let it. Mm-hmm. There's just some more slides that kind of demonstrate this. Branches that hang out over the river help cool temperatures, help with that shallow water habitat. Once again, kind of that concept of we want messy. We don't want a manicured presentation if we can. So we talked about filtration of runoff. I really need a remote control for this thing. So runoff can contain lots of things, really. It can, sediment, so like dirt, gravel, soil, whatever it's picking up as it runs towards water. Sediment's actually our biggest water quality concern in Windham County in our basin plans. But then also nutrients from agricultural fields. Excess nutrients are a major water quality threat. Pathogens, pollutants, oil, gas, toxins, lots of stuff can be moved by water. So if we can intercept that water and keep it where it is, that's going to improve our water quality considerably. So a wooded shoreline lot contributes about 0.03 pounds of phosphorus per year to a lake, based on this study. This was done in Wisconsin. As opposed to a developed shoreline property lot, it's 7 times more phosphorus is contributed to that lake from that lot because it's developed. And a buffer along that could obviously play a huge difference in how much phosphorus is reaching the lake. So there's a lot of research about phosphorus because it's a hot button topic, right? On the other side of the state, It's not such a problem for us over here because our water flows into Long Island Sound. That's the ocean, it's a saltwater environment, and so nitrogen is the key limiting ingredient there. So we're focused on nitrogen prevention. But fortunately, a lot of the science kind of works the same way. Another great benefit of a healthy buffer is that it can reduce flood damage. When those waters jump their banks and they carry all kinds of debris with them, if it slams into a nice healthy tree, that's way better than when it slams into your house or your car or your garage. And you could find all kinds of photos of this. I think a lot of these are from Irene, but just last July when we got hit pretty hard. And then again, at least twice since then, there have been some pretty significant floods. So yeah, buffers keep floating debris in the river. They slow the velocity of the flood water and they hold the bank in place, reducing erosion. That's Stickney Brook, which I think most folks recognize. You can see, looks spectacular, not really doing any damage. And that's kind of the fascinating thing. Many of the upstream portions of our rivers are wild and undeveloped. And in a major flood event, there generally isn't any damage in those places because they're allowed to just behave like rivers. They're not encroaching upon, or we're not encroaching upon them. So Margo's going to talk more about this, but buffers can provide really valuable wildlife habitat and corridors. So a 50-foot buffer will attract things like blue jay, catbird, common yellowthroat, muskrat, dusky salamander, green frog, water snake. A bigger buffer is going to obviously host a greater diversity of organisms. You can pick up Louisiana water thrush, Canada warbler, hairy woodpecker, otters, turtles, wood frogs, spotted salamanders. And if we go to 300 feet or more, now we're providing critical travel corridors, things like bears. Also enhanced native plant diversity. If you watch a forest over a long period of time, there's things happen, right? There's a blowdown, there's a gap created, successional things move in, the forest changes and evolves, and if it's a big enough block of forest, it can have those changes happen in kind of like a quilt, patchwork quilt. Where if we have little stands, then the whole system changes. When we get to smaller buffers, more than 100 feet is needed to maximize benefits to wildlife, but 50 to 100 feet can be really valuable just for treating runoff and improving water quality. And as little as 10 feet can help provide bank stability. So I think it's always important to remember, it'd be great to do the best possible thing, right, and plant a giant buffer, but that's not always feasible. We always have to integrate these kind of ecological and natural resources concerns with landowners' plans for their land and what they want to use it for. And so sometimes it's maybe you could just put in some shrubs right here, and that would be better than what's currently there. So when we do one of these projects, there are some key principles that we have to consider. Buffers don't pollute because they don't need fertilizing, like lawns might. They create a barrier to runoff. They capture sediment and nutrients. They can keep nutrients underground. So, like I was saying, it doesn't have to be an all or nothing. You could replace lawn on a shoreline with just a mix of native vegetation. The example on the left, the landowner just kind of let it grow and was like, let's see what comes up. And so it doesn't have to be a huge hands-on project. I will mention that you should keep an eye out for invasive species if you do that, because they very likely in the seed bank or will find their way there via birds. So that's a great strategy if you're somebody who's going to be attentive to the land and keep an eye on it. And then on the right, this is common with lakes. Folks often are like, I don't want to lose my view of the lake. You can grow a healthy tree and then you can do some trimming so that you maintain a sight line. Once again, not the absolute best solution, but better than just going, well, I don't want to lose my sight line, so I'm not going to do anything. Obviously, when we talk about design elements, we want to use native plants. We want to use plants that are appropriate for the soil type, for the moisture content, for the climate conditions of the local area. The easiest way to do that is to just look around and say, what's growing here, or what's growing nearby. That can be a pretty good starting point. If you work with one of the partner organizations to do a planting project, we're going to help you figure out what type of natural community exists on your land and what is going to make the most sense to plant there. Here's just an example. Leading native vegetation on this slope provides bank stability, wildlife habitat, water quality protection, and privacy. Obviously, we want to choose native vegetation, which is going to ensure that it's hardy and it can survive Vermont's winters and climate variability, and also it's going to help keep out invasive species. Invasive species love to invade a vacant space in an ecosystem, right? If you can, incorporate pre-existing landscape features right into the design. If there are rocks there, you can leave them there, or you can use them to augment the design. Contours, for example, a lot of these are like lake shore principles more than river, but providing switchback paths down to a shoreline as opposed to a direct path where the water can flow uninterrupted. Uneven ground, naturally uneven ground helps slow and absorb runoff. If you do live on a lake, there's a program called LakeWise that can help you figure out how best to manage your land for water quality and wildlife. There is a StreamWise program that is currently running on the other side of the state, and I'm really hoping that we're going to see it move this way, because I think it'd be really fun to work with riparian landowners. You can get, so with LakeWise, you can get certified. You can get like an award that goes up outside your house that says like, this property has been certified as LakeWise. So there's a little like social pressure there. Lake Raponda was just, we just found out is going to be a gold lake because enough of their residents have completed the LakeWise. There'll be a big ceremony this summer. So when we're picking a site to do a planting project at, one of the first big issues we run into are invasive species. They're an enormous challenge right now, right? If there are invasives, it doesn't mean we can't do the planting, but it does mean we're going to need to do some more site prep. This picture is taken in Dummerston, and there is a forest of knotweed taller than me. And we know that if we plant there, it's not going to make it. So we're in the middle of a 3-year project to try to remove that knotweed, and we're going to plant maybe this fall. I think we're finally getting to that point, which is very exciting. Another really key aspect is we need the bank to be stable for these programs. The state's not going to fund a planting where it's just going to fall into the river the next time we have a storm. And then, of course, we want to talk about what are the land uses, what are the landowners' priorities for that land. Another design element that can be really easy to do are willow stakes. So you cut off of a live willow plant and you keep the roots soaked, or not the roots, you keep the stakes soaked, and then you just pound these into the ground with a hammer. So it's a really cost-effective way to help stabilize a riverbank, and you can put them right into this like river cobble that's on the shore. A little more engineering here. You can do willow fascines where you bundle together willows, and then you tie them down, and you're basically like stabilizing a riverbank that wants to wash away. They're great for that. They're a little more costly, but they are much cheaper than riprap or armoring and far more ecologically friendly. Here's just some comparisons. The top one is a lake access that has a nice buffer, and the bottom one, they've completely cleared all the trees on that lake access, so it's greater potential for erosion and runoff. Example of how you can maintain a view through selective pruning. Once again, mostly something you find on lakes. I suppose you could do this on a river, but retaining walls can be replaced with an attractive vegetated bank. It's going to serve the same purpose and be a lot more beneficial to water quality and to wildlife. So if you want to do a planting project on your land, there are some funding options that will help pay for it. The biggest one is probably the Trees for Streams program. Trees for Streams and also the Woody Buffer Block Grant are state grants, and one of the partner organizations can help you access that. I'll talk more about that in a second. Another option, if you have land that is in agricultural use, there's something called the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, or CREP. And then there's also the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services Partners for Fish and Wildlife Program. So the Woody Buffer Block Grant or the Trees for Streams program, for your purposes, are the same thing. And any of the Vermont conservation districts can help you develop a project on your land and apply for funding. And we can do all of the heavy lifting to actually make the project happen. Other partners can do that. Any of the watershed groups are able to do planting projects. Conservation commissions can do them themselves, and we can help with an application if you want that assistance. Here are just some of the local partners. We're lucky we have a lot of partners to work with around here. These tree plantings, when we do them, they're really good public outreach and education events. We've worked with students from area schools to do the plantings, so you can give them a chance to do some hands-on work and educate them about kind of the benefits of buffers and why we're doing this. We can try to keep the plantings more cost-effective by doing that as well. Here's one that we did in Jamaica. And then we did one in Westminster, not far from here. It's a seasonal stream that's really just a ditch, but it flows into Sacketts Brook, which is a priority stream for protection. And so even seasonal intermittent streams are going to benefit from putting buffers on them. This is just some more pictures of that project. We had a lot of volunteers for that one. The other program I talked about, Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program with CREP. This is for ag land. The advantage to engaging with CREP is that the landowner receives land rental payments in exchange for not using that land, for productive purposes. So it's often like, hey, this stretch of your land along the stream is always a challenge to farm anyway because it's wet half the time. It's kind of like putting an easement on it, but it has a shorter time span. And then we do a planting project. With these, it's funding from the Natural Resources Conservation Service, which is a federal agency. They give the money directly to the landowner as opposed to a partner agency. But the landowner can do the work themselves and pay themselves for doing the work, or they can subcontract that out to a contractor or a partner like us. That can be worked out.
Yeah, we love that one.
And then also this quote from How to Hold Up a Bank. In any case, holding up a bank is not a multiple choice deal. There are only two choices, watching it go or watching it grow. If you have a smartphone, you can put your camera at that little square, and there are a bunch more resources online, or you can just go to our website and navigate to them. Thanks to some funding that Margo helped us secure from the Vermont Community Foundation, we created a number of resources around riparian stewardship, and those are all up on that website. And then I think we're going to transition and do questions at the very end. Let me pull yours up.
With municipal organizations like conservation commissions, whereas the conservation district tends to work more with individual landowners. But we both focus on water quality and anything riparian. So, and the nice thing about Windham County is that all of the water quality partners, Conservation District, our organization, Trout Unlimited, and Connecticut River Conservancy, and several others, we work very closely in partnership. So, if you contact one of us, we can also get you in contact with any of the other appropriate parties. So that's just something to keep in mind. So I'm going to build off of what Cory was talking about. You learned a little bit about the importance of buffers, what is a buffer, and how to install them, how to fund them. I'm going to take the angle a little bit more on rivers as wildlife corridors. And I'm going to see if I can figure out how to, oh, there we go. So we're going to step back a little bit away from just the riparian area. We're going to look at the landscape as a whole. So we're going to start with forest blocks. So forest blocks, are large areas of contiguous forested land. They're highly diverse and can support a large range of both plant and animal life. And we want to be able to connect these interior forest blocks so that we have movement of wildlife, movement of genetic diversity of plants. So being able to have these interior forest blocks and then the connectors that happen. So for example, here we have a large forest block, we have another large forest block over there, and then we have this habitat connector forest block. It's probably 20 acres or less. But it's still a very important feature because it's providing a linkage between these two big plots of forest. But you then have to get from one section to the next section. So one way to do that might be through wildlife road crossings. Road crossings in this case are where animals tend to move across the land in order to connect between forested blocks. And so they're providing a linkage. Another type of linkage, and that we're going to spend more time working on talking about today, is riparian linkages and corridors. So you're following a water body that's going from one forested block up to another forested block. So linkages can be forest, linkages can be riparian. And so we're going to focus mostly on this riparian area today. So back when the pandemic hit, this was one of my favorite things to entertain myself with. We're going to see if it works tonight.
Do you need audio?
No.
Okay.
We're just going to watch a minute of this or so. So someone set up a game camera in their backyard. They set it up, they looked at this log, and then they wanted to see what happened.
Nice. Good balance there.
Good balance. Nice perch to fish from. So I'm going to pause it there, but I encourage you, just look up like wildlife log crossing, and you'll get several of these. This gentleman, this was number 2. I think he's done like 4 or 5. But it's really fascinating to see who visits across a stream. Now we're seeing going from one side of a brook to the other side of the brook. And that's one important way that wildlife, riparian areas are helpful, because they allow animals to move from one side to the other with safety, but also then being able to get a drink at the stream. But they also work, let's see if I can figure out how to. All right, so just a little bit the mechanics of buffers, right? Over here, we have our lake or stream or brook. And then you have this first zone, which is closest to the brook. That, again, is mostly trees and shrubs. This provides shade, bank stability, insect habitat. So it's a very important first protection against what's happening in the stream, and providing life and cooling the waters and keeping the soil from eroding. Then you move into zone 2, it's also trees and shrubs. This filters runoff, uptake of nutrients and pollutants, so it's sort of, keeping all that runoff from going into the stream. And zone 3 is going to be more if you're in like ag fields and big open fields, where you have more of these grasses and herbaceous cover. And again, that's probably going to be your most filter control. This just shows developed land. So these 2 zones, and I wouldn't take these minimums. There's always so much difference in how wide buffers should be. As Cory said, any buffer is better than no buffer. But if we're thinking about wildlife, we need to have a combination of zone 1 and zone 2. You can't just have what's protecting the soil and what's right up against the stream. You need more trees and shrubs to provide protection and movement, especially for the larger animals. So, movement along a stream bank. So think about how you might walk along a stream. Well, it's sometimes just easier to walk on the edge of the stream than it is through the wooded part right next to it. Animals think the same way. They're going to take the path of easiest movement. So The other day, I went with a couple members of the Conservation Commission on Canoe Brook to look at, I always love saying this, we took a field trip to a culvert. And we're gonna get to the importance of that culvert in just a minute. But the entire way, here's a deer track, we followed that deer along the whole portion of Canoe Brook that we walked. You can see the deer coming in, it probably went over here to browse, and then it came down and kept walking away. But it's not just deer. Here we have some raccoon prints, we have fox, multiple animals, different sizes, all are using these streams as movement paths. But then they hit a barrier. This is I-91, a giant barrier. You know, we've all seen, unfortunately, roadkill on the side of the interstate. But then a lot of animals don't even want to move through there because there's a barrier of the guardrails. Or there's fences back away from the interstate. So there's got to be a way along these bigger paths for animals to keep moving through. This is on Canoe Brook. Our members of the Conservation Commission here that were my wonderful guides. This is under Route 5. This is a very unfriendly wildlife corridor or passage. These are big enough and they allow water movement, but they're perched. There's no like good footing for animals. So first they have to figure out how to get up there or get down. Not easy. In fact, we saw the deer come over here and then it went over there and it wasn't going to go through there. So that's not friendly to wildlife. This is downstream going towards the Connecticut River. This goes, let's see, was that the one under 91, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. This is much more wildlife friendly. So here we have, it's two culverts side by side. They allow the natural bottom. They're open. You can see daylight at the other end. It's not so scary if you're a deer because you can see what's on the other end. One right now has the main course of the river. The other one's dry unless it's high water events. That dry corridor is where we started to see a whole lot of tracks. I think during that course of that day, what we saw, deer, coyote, red fox, gray fox, something that was either a large mink or a small otter. We saw turkey tracks. I'm forgetting some.
I think you're doing pretty well.
Yeah, there was a lot. And it hadn't been too long since there had been a big rain event, so all of these were fresh. All of those animals had moved in through the last couple days. So if we're thinking about riparian areas, and they're very important for animals to be able to cross from forest area to forest area sideways, but also along. So here's Putney, and the yellow outline. These large green areas are the large forest blocks that have been identified for Putney. You have a lot of forest in the town of Putney. But these white areas are where fragmentation has occurred. So we're going to zoom in a little bit. And so here we're zooming in. Here's the village of Putney here. And just so you can get a sense, right? Here's Landmark College over here. And we're going to keep zooming in just a little bit more because I want you to take a look at this area. We have a large forest block over here. We have a forest block here. And we have more forest blocks up here. All right, so there's our forested blocks. So here you have Route 5, that's the red. The forested blocks come right up to Route 5 in that zone, right there. It's hard to see, there's some blue behind there along the road. And that's where the Conservation Commission has done some wildlife tracking studies over the years. And they found that in this stretch, there's a lot of wildlife movement back and forth over the road. Well, it makes a lot of sense when you see how close these two forested blocks are. So that's one way that a road crossing allows. But if you look at this, and you look at this, it's like, how is the animals, they can't come through here. So how are the animals here gonna move?
I'm sorry, I'm going to point out something.
Yep.
As a former Leonard College student,
Yep,
that pond that you see on the screen right there,
this one.
yeah, that the white, there is a forest in that spot, and there is forest on either side of that stream that you have to cross over to get to the what used to be the Windham College swimming hole. If you go along Route 5, along River Road, you can see roughly where the old pool was.
Nice.
So there is some wildlife there. I've accidentally scared a heron before.
Yeah, oh, definitely. And just because something is not in a forest block doesn't mean that wildlife's not moving through it. I live in the village of Saxons River. We've had bears in our yard. They move, they start to adapt to human life. But we also want to provide them with easy movement possibilities. We want to think about how animals can comfortably move, how plants, we can move that genetic material. So providing these spots where there's corridors connecting large forest blocks is important. But again, here's a forest block. What do? The village of Putney, and there's big rivers coming right through there. Well, that's where we can start looking at our riparian corridors. So, oh my gosh, help me guys, Putney, you all know which river this is.
You're talking about Sacketts Brook.
Sacketts Brook, thank you, I was blanking on the name. So if there were good buffers all along Sacketts Brook, between this forested block and this one, then we're starting to look at a nice wildlife corridor that's allowing the transference and the migration of animals both north and south. You don't necessarily need the forest blocks to touch, but looking at those riparian areas as connectors really allows us to begin thinking about. So this is an activity both looking for road crossings and looking for those riparian ways that something like the Conservation Commission could do. Start to notice, where are the hot spots in town? Where are these streams that are going to be really important to try to talk to landowners about putting in buffers? Or road crossings. Now the thing about road crossings when you have so much forest land like in Putney is, the deer is going to cross where the deer wants to cross. And it may be in the hot spot here, or it may try to go across here. So it's hard to plan for those wildlife crossings, but when you start to look then at the culverts that go under the roads, and one's about to get upgraded and it's in this area, you can say, maybe we should upsize that culvert so that more wildlife can move through it. Or you can say, maybe this is such a critical link between these two forested blocks that we want to do everything we can to protect the forest up and to both sides of the road there. Again, when we're looking at a town like Putney, there's so much forest land. We're lucky still. But if we think about development, what's coming 20 years from now, 50 years from now, as climate migration starts to happen, maybe some of these are going to get more fragmented, these forest blocks are going to get more fragmented. What can we do now to help protect some of these pathways? So there are some resources if you're interested in this topic. Fish and Wildlife, the Community Wildlife Program, has wonderful resources on their website. And they also, both of these books, which were in hard copy, are now available online, and you can download them. And they both talk about what is a forest block and what are wildlife corridors and how do we think about preserving them. And then this one is much more focused on how do we map them and how do we analyze those maps. So it kind of takes it, and then how do we start working with policies in our town plan to help protect these areas. And then, you know, I'm always available at Windham Regional Commission, so, you know, if you have questions about this type of thing, want to learn more, you're always welcome to reach out. And again, you know, we work very closely with our partners. They might do more of the installation of buffers. We might be able to help you more with the town plan writing aspect. How do we protect them into the future? So I'm going to turn this off so that both Cory and I, if you have any questions, we'd be happy to answer them. I actually should turn this off.
Thank you very much.
You both have your mics on?
Mine's on. Is yours on?
Yeah, mine's on.
All right. So if anyone has any questions.
I have a question for Cory.
Okay.
So in Dummerston, when you get rid of that knotweed, what are you going to plant?
We're going to plant native vegetation that matches the soil type and the surrounding natural community.
For example.
For example, in this site, we'll be planting sycamores, some white pines, some silver maple, some maidenhair fern, because there's actually a lot of maidenhair fern in the understory there, and we're hoping that the fern might quickly spread,
Right.
because we don't want to leave a vacancy, because that's what something's going to move into that maybe we didn't want.
So just for the people online, the question was in the
thank you.
Dummerston site that the Conservation District is currently working with, what's going to happen after they get rid of the invasives? So that's what Cory just answered. That was for our online community.
When you treat an area, or when an area is treated with an herbicide, is there residual buildup there? I mean, is it a one-time treating? Is it a several time? And how does that affect the plants that you choose to plant there?
Good question. The question was about if a site is treated with herbicide, is it a one-time treatment, or does it take multiple applications? And if so, how does it impact the wildlife, or sorry, the plantings that we put in? Yeah, that's a good question. Typically, it depends on the size of the infestation, but it usually does require a follow-up. We have one site we're working on, the one that I mentioned, that's a forest of knotweed. That's going to take 3 successive years of treatment, but the treatment gets smaller every time because what's left is smaller. In terms of how that impacts what we plant, I think we're about to find out because we're hoping to plant this fall. But the conventional wisdom from all the people who have done this I've spoken with is that your planting will succeed as long as you do it after. And that was when I first explored this project. I wanted to plant sooner, and I was like, sure, we can just spot treat around what we plant. And what most folks came back to me with was that your planting might not succeed, and better to do one phase and then the next phase.
I have a follow-up on that. And what about the water quality resulting from these applications?
That's a good question. So the question was about the water quality resulting from applications. I don't know that I'm entirely qualified to answer that question. The folks that I've spoken with who know more about this than I do will generally say that as of currently, based on what we've been able to study, we think they're safe for use. But they're also quick to say, we don't know what we don't know. And so that's where we definitely counsel for extremely limited use and trying to play the benefit versus the cost. So like if you have an entire riverbank covered in knotweed, we know that knotweed doesn't really host any other organisms. It's a foreign monoculture. It's a single plant. And so the insects aren't there anymore. And when the insects aren't there, the fish aren't there anymore, and you end up with a completely dead ecosystem. And that's where I think maybe there is a short-term cost to treating it, but if the long-term benefit is that we restore an ecosystem that can be around for a century, then that was a win. But we really want to make sure that we're not doing it, needlessly, or that we don't do it poorly and we end up with the invasive still there.
So another follow-up especially about knotweed, because I think we all see in this region that knotweed, especially after Irene, just has started to take over. And sometimes you look at the banks of the stream and you say, well, at least it's covered in vegetation, like knotweed.
Yeah.
Well, the problem is knotweed is very shallow rooted and won't hold the soil. So a big storm comes through, those high waters come, and the knotweed goes downstream along with all your soil, and all those little bits of knotweed then root somewhere else downstream. So again, it's that playing that, well, what's the benefits? What are the costs and what are the benefits? And none of us like to think, oh, using a pesticide to treat is a good option. However, what's the cost if we don't? It's always that tricky balance. And that's why working with licensed applicators is really important, because they know how to treat in the most minimal way. And they also are generally going to know which forms of those pesticides are better to use than others when you're near, hopefully they will know. Conservation District knows, like, what's the better form to use when you're in a riparian area. Because typical Roundup is not what you want to use in a riparian zone. But there's different forms of it that are more friendly to aquatic systems.
Yeah.
And my question is, after that, if you successfully plant it and trees start growing, knotweed will never come back?
So the question was, if you successfully plant, does knotweed never come back? I think knotweed requires a vacancy in the ecosystem to exploit. So hopefully, if that intact ecosystem doesn't suffer
Is there
massive
any
disturbance.
experience already?
Have I experienced?
Record of experience after you planted and how it happened after that?
I have not had that experience yet. I haven't been doing this long enough. I will say that the state of Vermont is really interested in the different planting approaches and what's effective and what's not. And they're starting to do long-term monitoring of all these projects they fund and compare different approaches and try to figure out, how are we best utilizing taxpayer money on these projects. Yeah.
It's sort of a similar question, but instead of it being knotweed, with glossy buckthorn, that's particularly took over all the places like the old beaver pond kind of shrank, and so
I think
is there a way that it can just sort of cycle out on its own, or does it only have to be dealt with as an invasive species that has to be gotten rid of?
I don't believe that it will ever go away on its own. If a mature forest can form over it, it's going to shade it out. But I'm not a forester, but my experience and understanding is that it's going to kind of keep that it's going to prevent that from happening. It's going to prevent trees from growing up. Because you've seen buckthorn can become a tree, right? It can basically grow so large that it's a tree. And so our northern hardwood forest can't really reestablish itself because it's in the way. That's the problem. So the reason invasive species are such a concern is that they did not co-evolve along with our native plants and vice versa. So things that evolve together over really long time spans, there's been this back and forth battle, right, of competition. And so it's like an arms race. They've evolved defensive capabilities against each other. They've figured out their niche, right? This tree grows to this height and it likes it when this tree is over it and this shrub is under it, and they all kind of coexist until a disturbance creates succession. Plants that are not native to here, those balances and relationships don't exist. And so often there's nothing that eats the berries or the nuts of an invasive. Or if they do eat it, it doesn't provide any nutritional value. For example, bittersweet. Birds love bittersweet, right? We're finding that it functions basically like a laxative. It's like junk food.
I think buckthorn does too. Buckthorn berries they have no nutritional value and they give a bird the runs.
Right.
It's great.
And they're spreading the seeds
Yep.
Yes.
when they're doing
That's
it.
right.
I think we had a question in the back.
Yeah. Is there a list, have you compiled a list of plants or things that can really, that are almost as aggressive as an invasive to just kind of dig your heels in for a minute?
So the question was about, is there a list of plants that are as aggressive as invasives that might?
That might smother them out, like ostrich farm, for example.
Right. So I mean, there are documents, if you go online and Google this, the Vermont Fish and Wildlife has a riparian planting guide. And so there are plant species that are recommended that tend to fare well in riparian settings, tend to be fast growing. But I have not found a silver bullet.
Because I'm thinking like something like jewelweed that grows really fast and really tall and really dense. I think has helped me in some spots with kind of giving me a head start with like the garlic mustard and so I think, at the end of the summer I'm going to go around and just gather seeds and things, and these bare patches of just it's not even soil, it's just gravel and sand and bits that the town has scraped up to make roads. I think I'm just gonna start throwing it in there.
Sure.
And the other place too that becomes a big problem is what's cleared through the power lines through the wood.
yeah.
Yep.
And those birds go and they get those buckthorn berries and they come and spread them all through. I don't know, does any of the utilities, do they get involved in the same project?
Yes, so the question was about power lines. Power lines serve as wonderful transmission corridors for invasive species that bisect our forest, right? So they're a huge challenge. I know of instances where the power companies will come in and treat chemically. I also know of instances where landowners have worked with the power company to say, we don't want you to treat chemically, which I understand. And then sometimes you get, if you ever hiked up a power line cut in the spring where it's nothing but barberry and multiflora rose, you will never see so many ticks in your entire life. They love that situation. And I think we need more research as to what's the greater good. Should we focus on suppressing the invasives in the power lines so they don't spread into adjacent forest blocks? Or are those power line cuts valuable habitat for species that otherwise don't really have, I'm a bird person, that's my primary obsession. And power lines host a whole bunch of birds that really don't live anywhere else in Vermont because we're a largely forested state. So I think there's some research that's needed.
But if they had those same plots instead of buckthorn, if it was the native viburnums and the dogwoods and things, those are also very aggressive and very versatile growers in those marginal forested or riparian areas, and the birds just love them. So, we hope they can spread those just as easily.
Yeah.
So I guess I just wanted to jump in and just sort of, it sounds a little defeatist sometimes, but when certain, it's certain invasives, when they've gotten to the point where they're so prevalent in the landscape, I'm talking the Japanese knotweeds, the buckthorns, the barberries, we could go on. It's more about management, and we'll never probably get to eradication. They're just too established. So if you are really interested in really trying to combat the invasive species, there is the Southeast Vermont SISMA, which is
Cooperative Invasive Species Management Association. My least favorite of the acronyms. Great group, just a clunky acronym.
And there is a website, and they do educational programs, and it's basically a volunteer group that come together. There's foresters, there's conservation groups, land conservation groups too, that come together and try to organize and help spread knowledge about how to work with invasives, but one of the things that like, you want to talk a little bit about the stiltgrass project?
Sure. So, how many of you have heard of Japanese stiltgrass? I see a couple hands going. So, yeah, so it's an invasive species that is pretty much new to Windham County in the last 5 years. It was first detected in the Westminster Road watershed. It has since been detected in a few other locations, including in Putney. It's an annual grass that is hard to identify. And if it can get into the forest, it just goes crazy and it can completely change a forest ecosystem. So we have some grant funding from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to try to do what's called early detection rapid response. We hope that it is still possible to prevent the establishment of this species.
What's it
here.
called again?
The plant,
Yeah.
Japanese stiltgrass.
Does it grow?
What grass?
Stilt? Yeah, and it does. It has roots that look like stilts. That's how it's named. Does
it grow further south along Connecticut?
It does. It's very common in Massachusetts now.
Connecticut?
I'm sure. Yeah.
It's moving north.
Yeah.
So,
Part of this grant, we're doing outreach and education. We're searching for it. We're mapping it. We're removing it when we find it. And then we've also installed boot brushes. So far, we've installed one, and we have 2 more that are going in soon at forest trailheads. And the hope is that if people wipe off their boots on these boot brushes, they won't track it into the forest with them.
so it's the early detection of species moving in that we can have the most impact as individuals. Something that's not super established. I mean, I'd love to get rid of knotweed, but that's going to be a tough battle, and we'll only ever be managing it.
There's this dream that they're working on an ecosystem, like, basically finding a bug that eats only knotweed that they can release. And I just keep dreaming that they'll figure that one out, because that's the solution, right? They've done that with other invasives. I know, I can't remember the one, but there's one in California that they found the bug that feeds on this thing over in Asia, and they released it, and it ate just that. It didn't eat anything else. And so it wiped out the plant, and then it died out because it had nothing to eat. And it's like the perfect case study.
We're lucky that it didn't become invasive itself.
Exactly.
So I think we have a question or comment in the back. Oh, okay. We have another one over here.
I have a question, just to take it back to buffers for a moment.
Yeah.
Does Vermont have laws in place to protect our buffers before we lose them?
So there are laws about lakes. Sorry, I need to repeat the question.
Repeat the question.
Sorry, not used to that. The question was, does Vermont have any laws in place to protect buffers? There are laws about lakes that do specifically regulate lakeshore owners. You can't cut down the trees and vegetation on your lakeshore. It's not super well enforced. In terms of rivers, there are Vermont's required agricultural practices that say that if you're an agricultural producer, you have to maintain at least a 50-foot buffer on all streams and waterways on your farm. But for non-agricultural landowners that I know of, there are no laws currently. Yes?
How does the changing of climate affect the plant growth?
So the question was, how does the changing of climate affect plant growth?
Well, the new species that are moving in.
Yeah, so if anybody's, the Department of Agriculture produces a map of the hardiness zones, so you can see like what type of soil you have or what it will support. And they just released some new updates this past winter, and it was shocking how much those zones shifted and how many plants that need to come off of our planting list and how many species probably we should be planting for.
Interesting.
Yeah. If you go online, just Google USDA hardiness map, and it is a shocking read right now.
And I just, thinking about the question of how is this, changing climate, therefore the changing of the species and the plants and the animals, they're adapting to this new and changing climate. That's another really important reason to have these habitat corridors. You have these large forested blocks, but if they are isolated, you're not getting the genetic diversity transfer. And so you're not necessarily getting the plant and animal species that need to be moving further north, where it's colder, up further into the mountains. So connecting these large forested blocks with habitat corridors is gonna allow that migration and movement of both animal and plant DNA.
Cool.
Yes.
I just have a question about the entire Connecticut River.
Okay.
How compromised is it from the standpoint of riparian buffers along the entire river? Is it like a wreck?
I wish we had Kathy here
I
from the
know.
Connecticut River
Okay, well,
Conservancy.
if that's
She
out
could-
of
she
your
could speak in
wheelhouse,
detail
that's
about
fine.
that. I'm just thinking about the
Or,
places.
or
that-
even just Windham County, if we want to be more specific.
The Connecticut needs more buffers. Obviously, one of the issues is there's tremendous erosion along the banks of the Connecticut, maybe due to the hydroelectric operation, maybe not. There's some disagreement about that. But yeah, that is a
But you
challenge.
said when you showed that photograph of that terribly eroded riverbank,
Mhm.
that will take years and years
Yeah.
to right itself, and there's nothing to be done,
Yeah.
which is very disturbing. When you say years and years, are we talking 50 years? Are we talking 100 years?
We're talking 50 to 100 years,
Oh
I'd
my
say.
God.
They're great. Like, if you go online and Google river evolution, you can see these little illustrations of like the different stages of a river. And so when a river's out of balance, you get a cut bank, right? And then at some point that bank's going to collapse in on itself, and then it's got to build a new channel. It's got to build itself new floodplain benches. Eventually, it'll all be sort of in balance if we don't mess with it. And of course, we have a lot of rivers in Vermont where we've rip-wrapped one side because there's a road over here, and so that river really can't ever achieve equilibrium in that spot.
And the problem with when we're doing that kind of thing and they call that hard armoring when you put in like large boulders or heavy stone. And unfortunately, yes, you're protecting that immediate infrastructure, and that is important. It's that balance between nature and human use, right? However, you're also transferring the power of the river to somewhere else downstream. So, if you're a landowner along a stream and you're starting to experience, loss of land, or your house is threatened, and you armor your bank, you're maybe transferring the problem downstream to a neighbor, because the river is having to divert itself and move away, and the power of the force now maybe goes across the stream downstream. So, again, there's that tremendous balance between protecting the human infrastructure. Our houses, our roads, they're important to us. That's how we live, it's how we move. But there's also the power of the natural dynamics of rivers. And, we have tried for centuries to control our rivers. And I think what we're finding is that the power of water is so great that it will find a way to do what it needs to do to move. And so I'm encouraging, we can think about our own piece of land, but it's a whole system, it's a whole dynamic. So working with your neighbors, working across the entire watershed, thinking about, if I do this, what happens downstream? Okay, what can we do to protect then this whole reach? The bigger we think in terms of a stream, the better. Because if we're just working on one little piece, it's not taking into account what the river wants to do. So I'm just going to plug that in there too.
I don't know if this is, sorry.
Oh, I know you've had your hand up for a while, sorry.
Thank you. I have questions also about the Connecticut River. Going back to two comments that were just made, I think one about what happens upstream impacts what happens downstream. And Connecticut is a long stretch. And also to what Ellen was saying, as a response to that about, you were talking about erosion. So I'm wondering what is the plan for the conundrum that exists on the Connecticut River, and what can individuals who use the river, access the river. I'm a rower, and I don't know how to think sometimes about what we should be doing down there when you mix invasives with erosion, with the continuity of the river. You know, the impact of, like, you know, you cut down the invasives, they get thrown into the river, they go downstream, they create erosion, so there's a conundrum there, and it's way too big for any one person to manage. Any thoughts on that?
You just went right for the big questions.
Yeah, sorry.
So the question was, along a river like the Connecticut River, which is so wide, so big, and has a lot of invasives, and you cut down those invasives then get into the water, they travel downstream, they root somewhere downstream. What can we do as individuals? I'm going to pass that over to Cory.
Thanks for that.
We framed the question really well, though.
So, I mean, of course, the Connecticut River is a highly altered river system, right, because of the hydropower dams. So it's not quite a lake, it's not quite a river, it's something in between. They are in the process of updating the license from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission on the 3 dams that concern us here on the river. And there are some proposed changes that will, in terms of how much they're allowed to pool the water up every day and then drain it all at night when they want to maximize electricity prices. Some of that's going to get changed, we think, and that might have some benefits to the erosion specifically. The public comment period ended 2 days ago, Kat?
Actually, yeah, last night.
Oh, it was last night, okay. So there was a chance to comment on the FERC plans, I know lots of folks did that. So that's one piece of it. The invasive piece, I don't have the answer there. We really need like a regional approach to some of these problems. We need more SISMAs, and we need funding for SISMAs to be able to gather all the right folks in the room and start working on some of these big picture items. Yes.
I'm not even sure if question is relevant here. I'm curious about the whetstone and what is going on there. What are they building?
Cory is.
And can you explain what's happening there?
In terms of like the project in Brattleboro?
Yes, the project in Brattleboro.
You mean the down at the end of Birch?
Yes.
Yes. So that's a Vermont River Conservancy project that I think was a district project long before my day.
Yeah. Jolene started it.
Exactly. Yeah. So the question was about the project taking place on the Whetstone in Brattleboro. If you go to the end of Birch Street, there's a turn in the Whetstone Brook, kind of like Williams and Birch. That was the old Sir Sosimo lot, I've been told. They are doing what's called a floodplain lowering project. They are removing enormous amounts of material to lower the elevation of that entire parcel so that when there's a flood, the river can access its floodplain because it was blocked from doing so for many, many years. That's going to allow a lot of water to be stored there and not hit downtown Brattleboro like it did during Tropical Storm Irene. And then they are removing, well, we'll see. They're supposed to be removing invasives and planting natives and building a park. So there's going to be, because parks are kind of a nice thing to put in a floodplain because they can flood. Right? We're not risking human investments in infrastructure.
Who is responsible for this?
The Vermont River Conservancy is working with the town of Brattleboro.
But it looks like they're planting trees.
They are, yep.
And those are trees that can be flooded and still survive.
Yep, it's a floodplain forest. We're gonna learn more because we're visiting it next month for one of our work meetings, so we get to get a tour of it and learn more about it.
Thanks.
Yeah.
The material that they're removing, what was there?
Mostly knotweed.
So where is that material going?
I hope it's not being taken off site, but do you know?
I don't know.
Okay.
I mean, so when projects like floodplain lowerings and berm removals happen, you have to have a plan for where that material is going. And it really depends on the site and so many factors about where it can go safely. So, usually when you're talking about invasive removal, if you can leave it on site, you cut down knotweed, leave it there.
Right.
Don't transport it somewhere else because you're just transporting the problem somewhere else. But when you're moving large amounts of material, like all that soil,
I can't even imagine how much soil that is.
They have to have a plan in place. We don't happen to know what that plan is, but you know.
If you haven't seen it yet, drive by. Like, I just happened to drive by last week.
Buy it all the
It's
time, and
dumbfounded
I'm
by
like,
how
it's
radical
enormous.
the change is.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm sorry, this is probably another big question. But given what you were just speaking about, is there anything that the conservation districts or your entities are doing with road crews and electric companies coming to properties and cut things and they repair, their long passageways? Is there any work being done with them to ameliorate the impact that they have moving this?
So the question was, are either of our organizations working with power companies or road crews to address the impact their work can have on invasives? The SISMA, which we're both partners on, has a grant to do, it's focused on the Westminster Road watershed right now. And we're working on a variety of things on mapping invasives and trying to educate the public about invasives and just get a better read on what's our current situation in the watershed. But part of that does include some outreach to road crews. So we're gonna try to visit a road foreman's meeting and talk to them a little bit about invasives and what some best practices would be. The SISMA is also engaged with the state's Agency of Transportation. They have a best practices document that goes out, and we've been given the opportunity to comment on the next draft and make some suggestions. So we think those are really good steps. In terms of the power companies, not anything that I know of right now. On a case-by-case basis, I've been on landowner visits and been able to chat about this with landowners, but yeah, you've had your hand up for a while.
A second ago, you said something about dams that were coming up. Where are those?
Dams on the Connecticut, you mean?
Where dams are coming out.
Oh, dams are,
On
I
the
did?
Connecticut?
Did you
Not
mind
on
this?
the
For the relicensing, is that what?
That's like.
oh, sorry, was this about the relicensing on the Connecticut River?
You were saying something about dams a minute ago, and you didn't mention where those were.
Yeah, so there are 3 hydropower dams on the Connecticut. One's in Vernon, one's in Bellows Falls, and one's in,
Northfield, isn't it?
well,
It's wild.
that's down Wilder, yeah.
Oh, wow.
And I guess Wilder impacts us some, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
This is a very innocent question, and I'm new to the area. The word invasives, I just have a question about that, because when I look at the human population, we've invaded in all directions. And that seems to be the nature of evolution. So is that conceivably the case also with the plant population?
So the challenge there is that the evolutionary processes that create balance in an ecosystem take thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. And so given long enough, sure, right? This is going to sort itself out, but I don't think it will be on a timescale that will work for our needs and necessary other wildlife's needs. And that is a frequent comment that we get when we talk about invasives is,
I have one more
okay.
question attached to that. Climate is changing, so that is also going to change the plant species. How does that work with this whole question?
So the question was about how the changing climate's going to change plant species distribution. So we don't, when we talk about invasive species, there's a lot of different terms thrown around. I've learned from working with gardeners that invasive can just mean that it's super aggressive. I'll have folks who want assistance with poison ivy. And it's well, that's a native species. We don't really want to wipe that out. I understand why you don't want it on your property because it can spread pretty aggressively and it has some negative effects on human health. So that's one term. And then there's exotic is thrown around, which is it's not from here, right? So when we talk about invasive species from a problem that we need to address, it's something that is not native to here and that will cause harm to native plants and animals. So when we talk about something that's in Massachusetts currently that wants to move north or something that wants to move upslope, as the climate changes, we're not viewing that as an invasive. We're viewing that as natural shifts.
Good, thank you.
Well, you all have had amazing questions, and hopefully you have learned a little bit about buffers and their importance and what you can do if you're a landowner or if you rent and talk to your landowner, or even if you don't live anywhere near a stream. But just knowing the importance of these things, will help you understand sort of the dynamics that are at play. And more, as we see these bigger storms and heavier rains, the drought followed by heavy rains, it's exacerbating what's happening in the streams. I'm sure you've noticed. When rain happens and those rivers, most of our rivers are what's called flashy, meaning they rise fast, they spread out, and then they drain. Well, that takes out a lot of material. So the more you understand this kind of thing, the more you're able to look at the landscape and say, oh, this is why that's happening. And maybe this is how the Conservation Commission might want to look at doing something, or I as a landowner, or just I as a private citizen. There's many ways that you can get involved. So I encourage you to think about what's something you can do. But if you have further questions, Cory at the Conservation District can answer all kinds of buffer questions, help you with getting buffers established. He can help find funding for buffers. If you're looking more at the regulatory side with your town plans or things like that, the commission can help with that. But reach out if you have questions. And if we don't know the answers, we will know where to find it.
Thank you.
Thank you.